Hello, everyone, and welcome to our conversation on well-being in the time of COVID-19. I'm very happy to be joined by three colleagues and dear friends, Julie Richardson, Yannick Baudouin, and Jim Drescher, to talk about what it means to look at right livelihood, well-being in the context of the great crisis that we've witnessed in the past 2 weeks as this pandemic has crossed country after country around the world. The title is a nod to Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Love in the Time of Cholera. Well, I think it's just as relevant to be talking about what does it mean to look at well-being in society and economy as we're seeing the fragility and the resilience of our current system. So I'd like to begin by introducing myself. I'm Julia Kim. I'm the Program Director of the Gross National Happiness Center in Bhutan. And I've been working for some time on the idea of building a new economy and society that puts well-being and happiness at the center of development. Bhutan has been measuring 9 domains of G&H as an alternative to GDP as a measure of how countries are doing. So that's me, and I'd like to hand over to Julie to introduce herself.
My name's Julie Richardson. I've been working in health and well-being actually most of my life. In the field of economics, how we need to transform our economic system to deliver health and well-being. Most recently, that's in the form of a PhD. I'm doing a PhD in economies of well-being, and I've also worked in transformative education, for example, at Schumacher College, where I set up a program there on economics for transition. And I've been advisor to the UK government about economic reforms to deliver health and well-being for people and planet. One of the transformative experiences in my own life was actually when I worked in international development. I worked in Botswana, and there I had this experience of how we'd been measuring wealth in terms of GDP wasn't capturing the whole story. And in Botswana, I noticed that wealth, there were many other forms of wealth like community well-being, about connection to place, ecological resilience. So I've been following up those leads for many years now. So thank you. I think I'll pass over to Jim.
Oh, sorry, Jim. I think you have to unmute.
Okay. My name is Jim Drescher. I'm sitting here in front of a window that it's hard not to look out of because the tree in front of me is full of birds. So I keep being distracted a little bit. I'm living in a place which is now called Windhorse Farm, which I've been here for 30 years. It's in an ancient forest at the edge of a lake and a river. It's a place in Mi'kma'ki, which is the unceded, unsurrendered ancestral home of the Mi'kmaq. For 7 decades, I've been learning about myself and about other beings of the land. And for the last 30 years, in this land where I live. So I've learned from many people. I'm grateful to my grandmother, who taught me how to connect with wild plants and animals. I'm grateful to the great meditation master Chogyam Trungpa, who introduced me to the view and practices of Buddhism. And most of all, I'm grateful to the land that continues to teach me about listening and about feeling, listening and feeling my own breath as the breath of the land, and feeling the body of the land as my own body. Now, my work today is mostly as mentoring and coaching within the field of nature awareness and exploring leadership as a healing practice, learned by seeing the reflection in living systems. So maybe over to you, Yannick.
All right, thank you very much, Jim, and hello, everyone. My name is Yannick Baudouin. I'm currently sitting looking at a very strange downtown Toronto, very quiet, not a lot of traffic. certainly makes you reflect on a lot of things. I am the Director General for Ontario and Northern Canada with the David Suzuki Foundation. Up until recently, I was 10 years outside of Canada, working on a variety of different sustainability issues with the UN. So it's been an interesting homecoming as well to bring some of those stories of sustainability back here. At the foundation, we started to work in a new area of looking at how we can catalyze conversations and actions around well-being, well-being economics, well-being societies. So basically trying to realign the purpose of Canada towards directions that are more generative, both for people and planet. So maybe for now, I'll leave it there and we'll continue.
Thanks, Yannick. I just wanted to pick up on that and say that one of the issues that might come up in our conversation is, why does well-being matter at this time? I mean, we've seen health systems crashing and falling under the burden of COVID-19. We've seen how vulnerable many of our populations are to the economic effects of lockdown or social distancing. And I was reflecting on Bhutan's approach, which seems very different and very relevant at this time. So in Bhutan, they would say that the success of a country is not just measured by its GDP and its growth, but how is it actually delivering for people and planet? So in Bhutan, they measure 9 domains, one of which includes living standards. So economics is clearly important, but they also measure things like time use. They look at community vitality. They look at how well cultures are thriving or not. How is the education system doing? A lot of different areas that they say create the environment for a good life. So as this economy and as our social norms are getting shifted by COVID-19 in a very radical way, I'm curious for us to have a conversation about what could something new look like? What is coming out of the soil at this time as these current systems are being shaken up? So I'd love to ask you a little bit to talk a bit more about that, Julie. You and I have both led programs in Bhutan for international folks who want to experience GNH, or gross national happiness. What has attracted you about the approach in Bhutan, and why do you think it's relevant at this time?
Yes, thank you, Julia. I think GNH was first introduced by the King of Bhutan in the 1970s. And at that time, it was seen as quite a radical idea, but increasingly it's becoming more and more popular around the world, from the UN showing interest and many businesses and many countries looking at it as a possible development model. And I just want to, some people think that gross national happiness is what's it got to do with happiness? Happiness seems like a term which is a bit light-hearted and maybe a bit fleeting. I just want to give the definition that the former Prime Minister of Bhutan, how he defined gross national happiness. He says, true abiding happiness cannot exist while others suffer, and comes only from serving others, living in harmony with nature, realizing our innate wisdom and the true and brilliant nature of our own mind, which I think is an extraordinary definition. And what really strikes me about that is that it's about the potential for us to grow into our truest self, but not just as a personal development thing, but in service of the well-being of others and nature. And Julia mentioned about the 4 pillars and the 9 domains, but what I wanted to talk about was my experience when I first visited Bhutan. And we went out into some rural areas and met with the villagers, and we worked with them for some days, harvesting potatoes, I recall. And we were talking about what GNH meant to the villagers. And although many of the people had heard of the term GNH, they didn't really understand all the different indicators or the framework or so forth. But what I really noticed was how they actually embodied it in everyday life. And that's my enduring memory of what GNH is for me. And how it manifested in Bhutan was in many, many different ways. It's a very cooperative culture, so there's very much a sense of sharing. For example, people build their houses together. They build the most beautiful houses made from local materials. There's a real sense of belonging and place and seeing the earth as a living system. And so for me, that experience in Bhutan embodies what well-being looks like in the culture of Bhutan. And I think, Julia, you asked, well, what can G&H offer in these times, and how is it different to gross domestic product? So most economies have growth in gross domestic product as their main goal. And G&H, I think, is an extraordinary alternative development approach, which is being trialled in Bhutan. And there's three differences that I'd like to mention. So the first is it puts health and well-being of people and planet at the core of the economy. So not economic growth, but health and well-being. And so that resets and reconfigures the whole thing. Secondly, the G&H model very much emphasizes the importance of resilience. So not just maximizing efficiency, but creating a resilient system. And a resilient system is one which can sustain and respond in a healthy way to unexpected shocks. So the G&H model talks very much about community resilience, economic resilience, and ecological resilience. And thirdly, which I think is unique to the G&H model, is that it integrates happiness skills, the cultivation of happiness skills. And we often talk about this idea of inner transition for outer transformation. So it's not just about adjusting policies on the outside, it's also about the cultivation of happiness skills. And for example, that includes the cultivation of awareness, of mindfulness, and compassion, so that we realize that we live in an interconnected world. So for me, those three things, and I'm sure others will be able to offer many more, are the three very distinguishing features of the G&H model, and why I think it's so good to look at in these current times.
Thanks, Julie. I really love how you brought back to mind the experience of being in Bhutan, and the fact that although it seems like a very intellectual exercise measuring progress differently by a government, it actually translates into people's lived experience, even in the rural areas where they may not be able to explain how all these things are being measured and used for policy. I also love the idea of the inner transformation and social change, the idea that these values that we cultivate now will help us when things become very difficult as they are now. And I know there's been a lot on social media about anxiety, loneliness, the wanting to connect to others. How do you keep your heart open and compassionate when there's so much fear? And so the idea that these are skills that can be practiced when we're in a more stable, supportive environment, and that they can be activated at times like this when we all so much need it. So very much agree with you on that point. Yannick, I'd like to ask you a little bit more about David Suzuki Foundation and why, under your leadership, they're starting to orient now to looking at well-being and well-being economics as part of their work on the environment. I mean, to many people, it doesn't quite jive together. What does happiness and well-being have to do with things like extinction of species and global warming and conservation? You know, for some people, there's a kind of a tension between too many human beings on the planet using up all the resources versus how do we, keep human beings well? How do we keep societies balanced and equitable? So maybe you could talk a little bit about that. Why is the foundation looking at this, and how is it connected to environmental issues?
I think it comes from a long-standing conversations about the tension between these different systems, right? We used to separate the environment as one thing, social and health is one thing, and the economy is something else. And you have these different bins. But now, of course, if you look at it through the lens of how, a healthy society is not one thing or another, or it's not these separate, it's really interdependent and interconnected. And one of the core operating systems, the things we have in our society, is our economy, is our economics. So economy is something we're always doing, but economics is how we think about the economy. So if we externalize the environment, if we externalize the social and the health from that system, and then we still allow that system to be the dominant decision-making piece, So, okay, what is the number one thing a politician might say during an election? Jobs and growth. And everything else is kind of secondary. We'll get there, we'll fix it, we'll do something later. Well, that's just a choice that we made not even that long ago, to separate these things, to externalize. So, over a number of years, the foundation and the founder and the founding family themselves have always tried to bring that connection back, to show that the story isn't separate books, it's all in the same book. And now we need to kind of, transform the way we think about those systems. What happens in a time of emergency and crisis, you start to unravel, in a way, perhaps parts of the system that aren't actually delivering what you need in normal times even. And now you're starting to notice the things that are essential. Your well-being is not only your human health and the health that we have and the caring that we want for the people around us, but it's also the health of the environment that we live in, the spaces that we live in. And they're not just the physical environment, the cultural environment, our artists, everything, all that starts to come into play if we choose then to kind of redesign and reboot going forward. So I think in the end, we've spent a lot of time in the Western worldview and the Canadian worldview, separating it out, all these things. And now suddenly we're noticing, wait a minute, they're actually not really that separate. They're actually all part of the same thing. And now we can choose to code a new system to recognize and internalize all those different pieces.
Thanks, Yannick. I really love the way you're describing the integration of what many people would have previously seen as silos. I think it's interesting and very telling that Bhutan, that has decided to focus on things like strength of communities, psychological well-being, thriving of cultures, at the same time has environmental conservation as one of their goals, and has received a lot of attention for the fact that they're the first carbon negative country in the world. They're actually putting out less carbon into the atmosphere than they're absorbing through their forests. So clearly there is an indication that these two can work, that they're not necessarily in going in opposite directions. That's brilliant. Jim, I want to give you a chance to talk a little bit from your experience at Windhorse Farm. You've had an extraordinary career, both as an entrepreneur, as a business leader, as a coach, as a forester, and also as a naturalist and environmentalist. So I was there at Windhorse Farm with you last week. I had the chance to go through the forest to really experience the land there. And you gave me a very interesting teaching around just a rotten log that we saw on the ground there, and what might be some of the lessons around leadership emerging from that. So I know that at this time of crisis, many people have pointed to the different politicians and their rhetoric and their responses, and at the same time saying it's a crisis of leadership. Where are the people who are embodying a kind of service or servant leadership? So I wondered if you could speak a little bit about the rotten log lesson, or anything else you might want to touch on in relation to leadership.
Yeah, thank you, Julia. It seems like a long time ago last week when we were sitting on that rotting log. And I said to Julia that I aspire to be a rotting log, which she thought, I think maybe was a little bit enigmatic. And I said, well, a rotting log is actually the fruition teacher of leadership, because the rotting log is just available. If you want to eat me, if you want to tear me apart, if you want to live in me, that's fine. So that quality of leadership, of being available for whatever is needed. I have a friend, I think of this as all being very simple. It's complex, but it's not complicated. I have a friend a long time ago, a person who was raised in Zimbabwe, and we were walking in the forest, and I said, first thing in the morning, I said, how are you? Are you well? And she said, I'm well if you're well. And ever since when I walk out into the forest in the morning, I have a feeling, do I feel well? And so I look at the forest and I feel well if you feel well, you being this incredibly complex web of life that we call the forest or call nature. And there's a lot going on there. You know, Yannick was talking about the economy and the social system and the environment. But in nature, it's all one living system. It doesn't separate itself out into we're the predators and we're the plants and it's a whole. And I think that a lot of what we are talking about when we're talking about well-being is being a participant in the whole, recognizing and living into that I am not more important or less important than any other being in this world.
Thank you, Jim. I think that really resonates with the kind of view and leadership that we're all being called to embody at this moment, not just our political leaders. And I think that the forest, the land, the beautiful place that you happen to call home is an amazing place to reconnect with that experience and that feeling of wholeness. That brings me to the exciting and quite adventurous program that the four of us are going to be teaching together very soon, the Right Livelihood and G&H program. It's the first time we're going to be launching it in Canada and Bhutan together, and it will start with an online module this November to bring everybody together from their various points of the world, knowing that many of us may not be able to travel as much as we would like this year. And then we'll be going to Bhutan to experience gross national happiness and to travel through the country as a group with the G&H Center in April of next year, in the spring. And then we'll be going back to our homes, really trying to improvise, innovate from what we've learned, and then reconvene at Windhorse Farm in near Nova Scotia in Canada in the following summer of 2021. So this program really, I think, is incredibly relevant and exciting to me to think about how we look for the new that's arising out of the chaos of this particular moment. I'd like to ask Julie if you could speak a little bit about why we're calling it Right Livelihood and G&H. What is the aspect of right livelihood that we're going to be exploring in the program, and why is that interesting and important for people at this time?
Well, I see right livelihood as gross national happiness at the individual level, at the personal level. But we'll be going on a journey together with peers. So our own right livelihood will be reflected by that community. And I think this time of crisis, everyone's saying one of the features of it is that it makes you ask, what's really important in my life? And let's let go of the things that aren't important. And so the right livelihood journey is actually an opportunity to give ourselves the time to do that together. And I go back to that definition of gross national happiness. It's right livelihood I see as the opportunity for us to take a path towards a generative path, a path towards seeking our highest potential, not as a form of self-development, but in service of the well-being of others and nature. So that's how I see the Right Livelihood Programme and the G&H fitting together, and it's such a fantastic, opportune time to be going on that journey, I think.
And I think, Julie, that when we've run a similar program before, we were really surprised at the variety and kind of breadth of people who were attracted to the program. It seemed to be people who were at a bit of a crossroads in their lives, whether they were just starting into a new career or trying to transition out of work that was no longer fitting or meaningful in the same way, so kind of pivoting, but not sure where they wanted to go next. Some people had just had a big relationship change or a job loss and were now really trying to reorient in a new direction. Some were approaching retirement age and still wanted to bring to life what their next phase or next purpose would be. So I remember it's a very fulfilling kind of opportunity to cross different generations and to see people from many different countries going through this journey together. I think we're really looking forward to hosting it for the first time at Windhorse Farm also, and seeing some of the aspects of nature learning, and touching in on the happiness skills that you mentioned, Julie. Also with Jim's deep experience in meditation, leadership, and nature learning, I think that'll add a great deal. And also to hear from Yannick about what David Suzuki Foundation is doing, bring in some of the experience of Canada, and really try to make sure that it doesn't stay an exotic experience of Bhutan, but it's really something that people feel they can adapt, implement in their own lives, no matter where they're coming from. So I think that really gives us an idea of why we feel these issues are important and relevant now, and what are some of the opportunities for exploring them going forward. I'd like to close by asking Yannick to maybe put up a couple slides that would give us a sense of where people can get more information about the program if they want to learn about the Right Livelihood in G&H program. And then there's a couple closing words from a poem that I wanted to read out, which seemed to me to really resonate with the times that we're in. Over to you, Yannick. And maybe while Yannick's putting that up there, just to say also that I feel that this idea of really connecting the right livelihood, the individual journey, the leadership practices, the happiness and well-being skills is a very big part of org/right-livelihood. So if anybody wants to find out more about the program, please feel free to go to the website. And then I'd like to close with this poem that I think has been making the rounds in the context of COVID-19. And it's a poem that I think really originated at a different time, not during our modern COVID-19 epidemic. It was written by someone named Kitty O'Mara. And I think while people are feeling the very difficult and challenging aspects of not just the pandemic, but the social isolation, the lockdowns that some countries are in, the difficulty of just getting enough groceries and food for yourself and your family, not knowing what's going to happen with your job, the shakeup of the stock market and the financial systems. While all of that is happening, at the same time, there is a sense that maybe something new could spring from this chaos, and that there are new seeds and new shoots of opportunity that we have to lean in and listen for and nurture as we go forward. So I would encourage each of us to listen in and see what those shoots of the future might look like in our own worlds. And here's the poem. And the people stayed home and read books and listened and rested and exercised and made art and played games and learned new ways of being and were still and listened more deeply. Some meditated, some prayed, some danced, some met their shadows. And the people began to think differently, and the people healed. And in the absence of people living in ignorant, dangerous, mindless, and heartless ways, the earth began to heal. And when the danger passed and the people joined together again, they grieved their losses and made new choices and dreamed new images and created new ways to live and heal the earth fully as they had been healed. So I think those are fitting words that resonate into our present moment, and I hope they'll give a source of inspiration and a spark of hope for whatever is emerging out of this great lesson from the COVID-19 pandemic. So again, I'd like to thank all of our listeners and viewers for joining us. Please check out the Right Livelihood in G&H program if you're interested. And I'd like to thank my dear friends and colleagues, Julie, Jim, and Yannick, for joining me on this program. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julia.